Hey everybody, Edo here, and I'm excited because I have Marc Davis on. Say hello, Marc.
Hello, everybody.
Oh, Marc, podcast voice. But Marc, you may not have heard of Marc. Marc has a website slash blog slash podcast called The Thoughtful Gamer. Are they all three the same or two the same thing?
Yeah, they're all called the Thoughtful
The
Gamer.
Thoughtful Gamer. And I was excited to have Marc on. I had been reaching out to different reviewers and content creators, and Marc, you're in a space that I am totally not in from a content creation standpoint, and that's a blog site, a website, and I'm on League of Game Makers, but I'm not like writing that much. And you have a lot of interesting content, right? You have reviews, which is interesting, but maybe not as interesting, in that you also are doing some strategy blogs, some sort of theory, game design stuff, game design, game mechanic stuff, and then the podcast. But you're also really new to the space, right? You started just earlier this year, right?
Yeah, sometime in April, I think, or sometime in the spring was when I first launched it.
Awesome. And so I have a ton of questions, but before we get into those questions, could you just give us like an overview of sort of how you decided to start a blog and podcast, and which came first, and what's the story there?
Well, I've been working on this idea of doing really in-depth board game reviews because I didn't see a lot of that in the board game space. You know, a lot of the reviews were kind of your standard, go over the rules, stand in front of a box, a wall of games. Not that there's anything wrong with that, since you're sitting in front of a wall of games.
It's the only
And then
corner in my house that looks this way.
No, I have a wall of games too. I'm just not where my computer is. And then give like 2 minutes of your thoughts on the game. I wanted to write real, like, in-depth reviews that don't follow that same structure that everyone else is doing. So I worked on that for a while, and then I got the opportunity to take some time to myself to actually try to make that happen. So the very first thing I wanted to do was do these really in-depth reviews. And then I thought, well, I'll try doing some strategy because I know a couple games pretty well. And then I wanted to talk about board game design because that plays into how I look at the games for the reviews. And then I have no idea when, but at some point I'm like, well, let's try a podcast. Why not? And I actually found that I've enjoyed the podcast part of it the most of anything, even more than writing the reviews, which was the original goal. So I just take ideas as they come to me, I guess.
Well, no, and I get that. When you're starting to do content creation for the first time, right, you find the area you start at, and then as you do it, you look for ways to mix things up or add new content and new types, and then sometimes you try, you podcasts and that kind of thing. So let's just jump into some of my questions. So when it comes to because a lot of different people listen to this channel, and it's not that I have that huge of an audience, but mostly it's either people coming into the industry or in the industry or looking for ways to be part of the industry, sort of that vibe. And if somebody is interested in starting in on the sort of blog website side of things, what is since you just did this recently or 6 months ago, what are the steps to sort of what did you do to get your site up and get sort of if we just focus on the blog portion for a minute, how did you get that started?
I've had a bit of experience writing or using WordPress before. I tried to do movie reviews a long time ago in college. And so I just do things kind of cheaply but effectively, I guess. So find a free WordPress template. And the main thing, my main strategy has been, okay, I want to bring people in who are interested in-depth, more detailed reviews along the lines of movie reviews, rather than what the kind of reviews we see a lot in board gaming. As far as how to get started, I just started with WordPress and just kind of built what seemed good to me. Sure. I'm not particularly adept at design or even like social media or anything, but I'm hoping my strategy then was bring in people who are going to follow me long term because they like specifically the content of what I'm doing. And so far, I think that's worked pretty well. But I would say in terms of like getting into it, it's not particularly hard. I'm not adept at anything.
Well, let me just, for the purpose of people listening, break that down just a little bit. So when you mentioned WordPress and Wix and a few other, um, platforms allow you to set up an account and set up a web page with a dashboard, and the dashboard is not terribly technical, but you're seeing HTML and you're putting in content and you're making decisions. There's a lot of stuff going on there, but there are a lot of tutorials. And what it does is it lets you pick templates, which you mentioned, which are like website looks. And once you've picked your website look, you just have different sectors, and you'll say, I want the content over here, and then I'm going to have, like feed, and I'm going to have the search bar and those things. And then you just start posting content by typing it in, maybe in Word or whatever you do, and then pasting it in, and then hitting some flags and decisions and submitting, right? And then
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, I don't know HTML at all, and I've thought about trying to learn it, but I've found a theme in WordPress that's robust enough that I don't really need to do those specific things unless I want to try to get really flashy. But to me, what I've done so far is attractive enough on the site,
That looks fun.
visually, that I can then focus on what I really want to focus on, which is, really thinking about the games and, putting a lot of thought into my articles.
And so then it's up and running. And then in terms of, you say that you're not so good at social media, but in terms of initially finding those people who you are interested in movie review like reviews, which I think is an incredible category because it really is great, and it tends to come through more in the in written, but just that sort of game in the time it arrived, and the space, and the arc of the just all that. Just there's so much more to a game than just I liked it or I didn't like it.
Right.
Though typically those are my reviews, but that's all right. I read movie reviews plenty. But how did you start sharing and getting people to be interested in what you were doing?
I was already, I know Facebook pretty well. I started using Twitter because of the website, although I hadn't used it before. So that was a learning experience. The main thing I think that has brought more views to the site is periodically posting things that I think are really good on Reddit, on the board games Reddit, even though Reddit is frequently annoying and people there aren't particularly nice. If you get something interesting and post there, I've seen, you can get a lot of views for that particular piece. And then I found that, a few people stick around after that. So those are the main things I'm doing: Facebook, Twitter, and occasionally Reddit.
And you found that you've been okay with the occasional Reddit? That in itself hasn't been dangerous?
What do you mean?
Well, I've just with Reddit, I find that it's the least welcoming of sort of drop-in sharing, as opposed to in Reddit. They're very keen on people being a part of the community and engaged on the threads. And if you're not around, and then at some point you're like, here's a link, and then you disappear, that I've found people are not very, very happy with it.
Well, when I first started, I sent a message to one of the moderators. I'm like, okay, what are the rules here? Right. And they said only 1/10 of what you submit on the subreddit should be your own content. Right. So I make sure to go on there occasionally and comment on things.
Okay, so
to try to keep that ratio. Plus, I can find ways to just embed my own links into the comment. So it's like, what game do you recommend? Well, I recommend this game, and I write a couple paragraphs on it, but within that, I'll link to my review of it, which seems to work out okay.
And that seems reasonable, right? You're responding, but also...
It's not just a link. It's just, part of the comment.
Yeah. Okay, and so that's how you got your website set up. And then you moved over here, and then you're like, okay, well, let's do this podcast thing. And you got the mic with the thing in front of it, and it's all cool.
Yeah.
Had you done podcasts before? How did you make that transition?
I hadn't done it before at all, and I had no idea what would go into it. So I got this mic because based on some research, and then I got a couple other smaller mics, and it was after PAX East. We're like, well, let's do a podcast about our time at PAX East. and that ended up being the first episode because it was just really fun and shockingly easy. Once you have not even great mics, like decent mics, and
I mean, you're just
you
talking,
just try
right?
to, you're just talking, and you just try to keep, make sure no one's like yelling in the background. Like Audacity's like noise reduction, Audacity, which is a free program, like their noise reduction's really good. Their tools are really good. It's amazingly easy to edit audio. I found, like you can cut together things and you don't even think it's going to work, but then you listen to it and it's flawless. Like it was way simpler than I thought it would be. So along with the fact that I enjoyed the conversations, I think we got a pretty good system up with kind of how we, go even deeper into games. We'll have an entire hour-long episode about one particular game, or we'll talk about things more broadly, whatever's on our mind at the time. Combined with the technical ease of it, it was actually really fun.
And so how frequently are you doing the podcast?
The main podcast is every other week, but there's always something in the off week. So for a while there, we did a top 50 countdown where I counted down my top 50 games. Sometimes it'll just be me sitting here at the desk rambling about something for 20 minutes. We started doing a Star Wars RPG that we're recording, so that has been the last couple off-week episodes, is just the audio from that. But it's something more casual.
Right.
And I reserve the main, something we put more care into for the main podcast.
Well, I'm sure you put care into all of it. As not as in depth,
not as much planning.
And so in terms of the audiences, right? Because both in both places you're new, you're sort of trying your own type of content, and you're growing your audience. Is it easier in either category to sort of know how you're not the trending, but know how you're progressing and growing as a content creator, or is one easier than the other?
Not particularly. You can get stats, from WordPress about how many views you're getting. I'm on Podbean for podcasting, and that shows how many downloads I get, and so I can see those numbers kind of slowly rising on the average. But other than that, there's not a whole lot. Like iTunes for podcasting gives you absolutely nothing. You don't know anything of what's happening on iTunes, but that's the major source of podcasts for people. That's like 70% of the market or something. So there's not a whole lot other than just getting the download count from whatever place you're hosting your podcast on.
And as of right now, I mean, and again, you're growing your channel, but as of right now, are there are they even paid podcasts? I mean, all podcasts are free, or some podcasts free? I don't even know how podcasts are.
Everything's free.
Everything's free. Okay, yeah. And so are in either case, like on your site, do you have any ads? Are you doing any sponsorship, or you're just starting your hobby, content creator, driving it forward?
Everything's free. There's no ads right now. My plan to monetize is to start on Patreon sometime in October.
So this it may or may not be there yet. If it is, I'll link it, but I don't know yet. So we'll see.
Yeah. I don't have a firm date yet, but sometime in October I'm going to start on Patreon. That seems to me, for me, the best way. I don't like ads personally. I know a lot of people use AdBlock. I use AdBlock. And I like kind of the direct interaction that Patreon offers with people who are actually interested in funding, the enterprise. So that's the direction I'm going to go for now. I'd rather keep it simple and straightforward that way than try to introduce advertisements in the podcast or on the website or something like that.
And on the Patreon side of things, presumably you're going through that sort of learning research curve in terms of understanding the platform and the expectations and getting everything ready. Right.
Yeah, I'm brainstorming all kinds of different rewards. I think the main thing I'm going to be presenting as kind of extra rewards for people is kind of just more of an in-depth look at day-to-day things I'm doing. So like access to my massive Google Drive of like half-finished articles and stuff. I think that would be interesting for people. Or getting access to like an exclusive live stream of the podcast if they want to get it live and unedited, and get all of our random side bits that we edit out. those are the first two things that came to mind. I have a whole list of ideas I'm brainstorming for rewards for backers, but yeah, I'm in that kind of phase of trying to hone in what my strategy is going to be.
And actually, just a quick question. You said we a few times. Is there a crew or who else is involved?
I'm
Or is you just using we
I'm
in
an well, I'm the thoughtful gamer basically. I'm the
right?
one doing most of the things, but I have a couple of friends who regularly are part of the podcast. It's not just me on the podcast.
Got it. Got it.
A couple of regulars and then occasional other people,
And
other
so,
friends I know.
but they're just contributors to the main content.
Right? Yeah, they just enjoy talking to me for some reason.
Well, hey, yeah, I'm enjoying talking to you. You're a nice guy. Um, so, so I think again, sort of in that first barrage of questions, I was sort of looking at again that sort of, hey, here's somebody that's just sort of starting on the podcast scene, starting on the um, website, blog, trying to do different content. I mean, on the advice side of things, is there anything, just sort of generally that you've picked up in the last 6 months, sort of jumping in, that you would give as advice to somebody that was like interested in whether it's a podcast or a website going on their own?
I mean, the main advice I got and I saw when I was doing my initial research was try to find some way to stand out, and that's difficult to do, but it's still good advice. I don't know how much I'm standing out, but I'm trying to with the way I'm doing reviews and the way I'm being very thoughtful about what I'm about going in depth to with my analysis on games and game design and game theory and all that. So I think that's good advice. It's always good to stand out. The main thing from my personal experience is particularly with a podcast, if you're interested in it, like the cost in terms of money and time is not that high. It's substantially less than you would think. Like the mics I'm using, not this one, but the other ones I'm using are really good, and they're like $20 a piece. And the recording software I'm using is free. The editing software I'm using is free. It takes, for an hour-long podcast, it takes an hour and a half to 2 hours to record, and then maybe 2 to 3 hours to edit. That's it for an entire episode. And I had no idea it was that simple. And as long as you take decent precautions, like, again, having a fairly quiet room and getting like a pop screen. These pop screens are incredible, by the way. It's amazing how much they do in terms of audio quality. You can make a pretty good sounding podcast without much time or money.
Cool. And do you find that through this you sort of become an audiophile, like knowing what a pop screen is and learning more about the sound in the room? And like, are you at restaurants and you're like, you see the ceiling, that's not really dispersing the sound very well? And
no, I'm not picky about it, I guess. Again, my like the same thing with like my website design. Like once I get it to a point, I'm like, yeah, that's pleasant to look at. I don't get obsessive about details, even though I probably should in some cases.
sure.
But with the audio, once I get it to a point, I'm like, wow, I would listen to that. I wouldn't turn that on and be like, oh, that's bad quality. Once I hit that point, I'm like, great. I'll try to find ways to make it even better, but I'm not obsessing about it. I guess it's just how I go about things. I'm always more obsessive about the quality of the content and having really good conversations on the podcast or really good writing on the reviews and things like that.
Well, and so for the reviews, and I'm jumping around a little bit, one of the things that comes up a lot when people are talking about reviews is sort of that, how much are you playing, right? How many times have you played to give your review and things like that? And there was that article, I think, from the guy from Portal, Ignatius? I don't remember his name. I don't know if you know.
Ignacy, yeah.
Yeah, Ignacy, on the eBay Your Bike sort of. I don't know if you've read the little thing he wrote up on BGG about sort of player expectations and I always, it's a sort of it's an interesting article, but I think the name of it is like, would you let your dad eBay your bike or something like that? But when you are doing one of your reviews, like what's your process in terms of game selection? Is it just games you're playing? Are you picking specific things? I mean, how do you make one of those reviews?
I mean, I started off as one should with just reviewing the games that I already have because they're there. There's no expense to reviewing them. You've already played them. I'm starting to get more and more review copies of newer games, which is really fun. I think the question of how many times do you play the game before you review it is troublesome. And I like the way Tom Bassel does it whenever he's asked that question. He says enough times. And that's really the only answer that you can give. But
Perhaps.
I think it's really the only answer. Like some games you play them once or twice, and I've never reviewed anything I've played only once because I'm always I always want to give a bit of charity, even though I think it's really good or really bad. It's like, okay, let's try it at least one more time to just check on a few things, but certain games require more playthroughs than others. Like I had a review recently of a game called Outpost Siberia. We played it through once. We were just baffled by it because it seemed impossible to win. And I got a little bit obsessive about it. I'm like, okay, I'm going to figure out how to beat this game. It's a cooperative game. And I ended up playing it probably 8 or 10 times over the course of a couple of days just to try to beat it. And I never could, by the way. It's insanely difficult. And then we're like, can we beat this game? So we ran some numbers and found out that at certain player counts, it's almost impossible or maybe impossible based on how the deck... Actually, based on how the deck is shuffled, in many cases it would be impossible to beat. And so in that case, I think we had to play it enough times to get that knowledge and that information and get obsessive enough to actually answer these questions in our head. But in other games, you play it once and you're like, okay, I pretty much get what this game's about. And then I'm like, okay, I'll play it again just to make sure. But it really depends on the game to me. And I think there's no exact number. Well, it just depends on the game.
Oh, I mean, I certainly agree with that. And in the context of, games that are, some games are shorter or longer, in scope, right? Like a game that's quick filler isn't necessarily going to have the same depth as something that's more, a full-on 4 hour,
Right. And part of what I do, part of what I did deliberately with the website is that I split my reviews into actual, what I call reviews, and then first impressions. Right. And they look the same, and I approach them the same way in terms of what I'm writing. The distinction is, if I label it a first impression, I'm not completely settled on what my long-term views, or I'm not completely settled about what this game's going to look like in the long term, after 15, 20 plays.
Right.
If I post it as a review, I'm pretty certain that I know what that experience is going to be like. Yeah. And so it's...
Yeah, it comes down to...
I've had friends comment that they look the same, and so they should just be posted the same, but there are subtle differences in how I approach the first impressions versus the reviews.
Sure, and some games have more emergent play than others. I think for me, one of the the other sides of that coin is, and I do like Tom's answer to that. He gives it all the time. I think that I think the idea that gamers in general, and there's certain different categories, are playing games. When people just to go all the way to the extreme, people shouldn't review games unless they've played it 10 times, as an example. I don't think many players play games 10 times anymore. I think the content that's being... no one would say, you can't review that movie until you've watched it 10 times. Right.
Right.
The way people consume and play in general, given the volume, given the way games are being built, are driving to, Certainly, you get your favorites, but a lot of people check out a game, they play it once, see if they like it. Maybe they buy, maybe they don't. But they're not sitting there being like, I'm not going to decide whether or not to buy this if I don't play it 10 times, And if they do
Right.
buy it, it just gets into the growing libraries of content. So I think and games in general, the quality bar. They're still crappy games, right? But the quality bar of just like AAA, high quality, great design, fabulous looking, amazing production games is through the roof. Like each year, it's not as if it's like
Mhm.
one good game and a bunch of crap. There's just tons of great games, and I think people are shifting more towards. I don't know if there's a word for it. Perhaps you do, but like experience gaming versus like mastery. Um,
Mhm.
and so I think board game publishers in general are starting to understand and learn about that, and that's perhaps where some legacy stuff came up and some other content. But that if it's not fresh anymore, or the hotness or whatever, people they're interested in checking out the next thing because there's so many things to look at.
Yeah, and I've actually toyed with the idea of writing an article about how ultimately there are two types of games. Experiential is exactly the right word that I thought of. There's experiential games, the extremes of which would be something like Arkham Horror, and then there are puzzle games, the extremes of which would be like Go or chess. And while pretty much every game has a bit of both, like those are kind of two ends of a spectrum. And it does seem that the experiential side of things is really becoming becoming the popular thing now. It's particularly in America. Like, and even historically, you can look at, when modern board games took off, it was with these really dry German, French games that came over, and they're certainly on the more puzzle side of things. But then there's this wonderful kind of collision of really thematic ideas and then European mechanical concepts. Where you see like Twilight Imperium is like one of the most thematic games ever made, but it steals directly from Puerto Rico, which is about as dry of a Euro game as you can possibly get. But I think you're right that the kind of trends are more going back toward that kind of American style of experiential games, which can be interesting, but uh, you obviously have to watch out to make sure that they're mechanically solid.
Oh,
Um,
sure, sure.
and then going back even further to the idea of how many times do you play the game, I think when people say, "Oh, you need to play it at least 10 times before you can review it," what they're actually saying is you need to have some understanding of how well the game holds up after 10, 15, 20 times. Like I'm looking over your shoulder there, and you have Catan. Other side, you have Catan, and Catan's a fine game, but in order to review that game, even if you haven't played it 10 times, you have to understand that ultimately, like the setup, the first phase of placing your initial settlements in Catan is so important to the game. And once players figure that out, that can take away from the experience of the game because players will start feeling like, oh, the game's settled at that point. That's a main criticism of Catan, and it affects the long-term play. Then you have, a couple games over, you have Five Tribes, which has a different problem where the game can seem confusing or can seem like overloaded when you first start playing it because there's so many choices, but then long term it's balanced out by their bidding system, which can accommodate players who have more knowledge about the game. So I think what people are saying is that you need to understand how the mechanics of the game are going to affect long-term play. And I think if you do that in your reviews and you take that analysis, they won't care as much necessarily of how many times you've played the game.
Sure. Though to some extent, I'm sort of saying, because you mentioned the experiential and puzzle, and I think those are two vectors that you can look at. I was meaning in the experiential. I was meaning a little bit more like, not necessarily thematic and experiential. I mean, it's that kind of thing, but it's also just this idea that you're like, let me look. What's a game? Using the games behind me now. Apparently, this
Sure,
wall
sure.
that you made fun of at the very beginning. Kerala. Have you played Kerala?
I have not.
Have you played King Domino? These are my
No,
shelf
but
might
I've
be able to
seen
do.
it.
Okay,
I'm
well,
really bad at keeping up with new
no,
games.
it's fine.
I know what King Domino's
Okay,
about though.
well, good at least you've heard of it. But so in Kerala, it's a pretty simple game where you're tile drafting and there are placement and movement rules. And anyway, I like it a lot.
Hmm.
Played it, enjoyed it the first time. Played it much more. I don't know. Played it probably at this point 5 times, maybe 4 or 5 times. I'd have to probably 5 with the first two-player game. Um, Chances are I will play it 3 more times over the next 2 years. Right?
Sure.
Like someone will be over and I'll be like, you know what game you'd like, and I'll pull out Kerala. But
Hmm.
like, it's not like there isn't a game here that is sort of like smacking the table constantly. And part of and part of it is unique in that I have access to and end up playing a lot of games. But I think people are more in the habit now of playing and experiencing and doing more types and different
Hmm.
games. Just there's so many cool, great games that you'll have your favorite, you'll have your one, or you'll have the game that you do play a lot, perhaps. But I think generally speaking, if you averaged out the number of gameplays of
Right.
games over time, just universally, you would see that when there was only chess, it was a
Right.
ton. But as more games are available and coming out at such a rate, I think people naturally and comfortably are playing games less,
Hmm.
specific games less times, but playing more games more times, right? Like so, it's like
Yeah.
rather than one game a million times, it's a million games 4 times. You know what I mean? And
Right.
so
Right.
I think there's some general changes there in play behavior that leads to a more fickle. One of the reasons you have the spikes in hotness, you see it in mobile too, is that people, they're checking things out, and if your rules are confusing now, like if it's dense and impossible to play, there's somebody who'll go in and really like figure it out and maybe have some really long term love. But a lot of people can be like, this game, this mess, the rulebook's a mess. I'm just not even going to deal with this because I can play another war game that doesn't have a mess and jump right in, or another puzzle game or another this. You know what I mean?
Right. Exactly. Um, and I think people play games fewer times than they think they do. And I've even experienced this where like almost 2 years ago, I started recording all my plays on Board Game Geek. And so I know exactly how many times I've played certain games, but I'll have friends who are like, man, we've played that game. We must have played that game 10 times in the last 2 years. I'm like, well, I'll look up exactly how many times we played this game, and it's like 3 times. Like you think you play games more than you actually do. And then I completely agree that, kind of the bar for newer games is set higher because we have such a wealth of fantastic games coming out. Part of what then concerns me, though, is that it then gives an incentives for publishers to prioritize kind of like the first 3 plays of a game over its long-term viability. And I don't know if that is actually affecting publishers, but there's certainly an incentive there because games like they stay in the news cycle a very short amount of time now compared to how they used to back in the kind of I guess the Eurogame heyday. And so kind of getting that prime hotness spot, on Board Game Geek, or getting all the videos, and then having a really great first experience of the game is now that the publishers are incentivized to do that. And if the game ends up being imbalanced in the long term or just less fun in the long term, they'll get criticisms maybe deep within the forums of Board Game Geek, but they're out of the news cycle now. And
Yeah,
so I worry if we'll see, 3, 5 years from now that the games we were buying, the last couple of years really weren't as good as we thought they were.
oh well, I think that happens. I would actually think it's a little different from a publisher's perspective. Not that I represent all publishers in any way, but I think I think you're right. I think you are seeing that trend and things like that are happening. Though there's plenty of amazingly deep games that still
Oh
come.
yeah. I'm not saying publishers are
Yeah.
doing it. I'm saying there's an incentive there, and publishers need to be aware of that.
I think the fact of the matter is, maybe not the fact of the matter, but perhaps the fact of the matter is, at the end of the day, there's marketing and there's things you can do to get your games to sell and move through and get that initial spike. But the games that last, the
Hmm.
games that have long-term success, are games that have strong word of mouth. And honestly, the way I put it when I think about it is virality. And virality in board games isn't a Facebook post. Virality in board games is people who want to take the game and play the game. And things that impact virality are obviously the fun you have, but your willingness to play it more, and how quickly it can be played and how many people it can accommodate, and those are the ways it gets spread. People get spread because somebody says, "Hey, let's play this," right? And
Right,
so
right.
the more people can say, "Hey, let's play this," and want to say, "Hey, let's play this," and feel good about saying, "Hey, let's play this," the more it stays on this shelf, the more they play it at conventions, the more people get to tell about it. I mean, it's one of the reasons you see games like, I mean, I don't want to drive all the way into party games, but if you think about just the extreme, like a Cards Against Humanity, a game that's loud and offensive, but a game you want to like show your friends to be stupid, like gets popular very quickly and grows very quickly because it has that virality quotient. I think deeper, longer games have it too, but you know, you're going to sit down, you're going to play it at a con, and you're going to play a big game, and then the people who are in that group are going to grow. But so I think while I, on one hand, made this argument that people are playing games less frequently, I think still, if you look at the long-term staying games, they're games that people enjoy playing regularly and enjoy sharing and playing with other people, because that's what sort of keeps it alive, if you will, in the sort of
Yeah.
ecosystem.
Yeah, and those are the games that should be highest, more highly praised too,
Right.
right? That's why I really focus as a reviewer on trying to figure out if games are going to be viable in the long run, if they're still going to be fun in the long run. And I think it's really important for reviewers to do that, just because there are many games that are great the first time you play it, but as you keep playing the game, right, the number of games that continue to be great necessarily grows smaller,
Sure.
or almost necessarily, I
Oh,
suppose.
and then you're starting to see. I mean, I just went through and I did a bunch of. I actually don't have them anymore because I chucked them all, I think. But I did the Exit the Games and
Oh
Unlock
yeah,
series, and it's a totally different type of thing, right? Like it's puzzle, but not in the abstract way you were talking about it before. It's a literal
right, right.
puzzle where it's like, no. Here's, once you know the answer to this question, it's no longer a question anymore.
Right.
And so. That's a totally different one-shot play type of experience. Where you
Hmm.
see a game like Pandemic that established this fantastic base of game and game mechanic and combination. And maybe you hate it, maybe you don't, but so much of a base that they were able to extend that and then throw that into a legacy game, and then have the legacy game play on top of the core mechanic. I mean, you look at Catan. There are a lot of games that have become that sort of mechanical base for like expansion after expansion after expansion, right?
Right, right. Um, and I need to play more of these escape room games. Are the exit ones? Do you like tear up cards or anything, or
Oh
can they
yeah.
be?
So
You do?
the
Okay.
unlock ones, you don't have to tear up anything, or you literally
Okay.
can play.
So
They have,
you could finish those and then like give it to a friend and then they can play it.
yeah, oh, absolutely. And and
Yeah,
and,
yeah.
and actually, I wonder how that affects the unlock sales. Like,
Yeah,
you,
because I think I mean, obviously it provides a design restraint, but that seems to be a really cool system of doing things where, yes, you play it through one time, but then you could like pass it off to a
well,
friend and
but
then they can play with their family.
yeah, well, but and I'm pretty sure the Exit series has been more successful. But I guess what I'm saying is, I don't know, since that model is
Hmm.
play and be done. If you give me a version of it that doesn't require me to do that, if it's play and I can reuse, but effectively there's no reason to ever play a game. Like, once you've played an unlock, you're no more. There's no more reason to play it than anything else. Then
Right.
you do say, well, I'm going to give it to somebody,
Hmm.
but they're not buying it. I'm just giving it to them. And
Right, right.
so, where with the exit, like you use it up and you're like, man, I want my friend to play this. Well, I buy it for them as a gift.
True, yeah.
I wonder how it goes. But we're actually, you'd be amazed, but we're at the 40-minute mark, which
Oh,
means
wow.
that we're about to become a pumpkin on my recording. One of the things I need a new computer for. But so let me just thank you for your time. Really insightful stuff, thoughtful gamer, and you're also going to perhaps having a Patreon soon. Uh,
Hmm.
and thanks for coming on.
Well, thank you for having me. It was really, really fun conversations here.
Yeah, it was good. All right, and thanks everyone for watching.